In the sweltering summer of 1518, amidst the narrow, bustling streets of Strasbourg, a city that had long stood as a vibrant crossroads of commerce and culture along the Rhine River, an event so bizarre and unfathomable unfolded that it would etch itself into history as one of the most perplexing medical and sociological mysteries of all time. What began as an isolated and seemingly inexplicable episode of uncontrolled movement soon spiraled into an uncontrollable mass affliction, turning the city into the stage for a macabre and frenetic spectacle that defied both logic and medical understanding. It all started with a single woman, known in the few historical accounts that have survived as Frau Trophäa, who, for reasons unknown, stepped into the street one day in mid-July and, without music or apparent provocation, began to dance. At first, those who witnessed her unusual movements assumed that she had either taken leave of her senses or was performing some form of personal or religious ritual. Yet, as the minutes stretched into hours, and she showed no signs of stopping, their initial bemusement began to turn into unease. Her feet moved with an almost mechanical insistence, her arms flailed as though guided by an unseen force, and her expression remained vacant, as if she were trapped in a trance from which she could not wake. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops and darkness enveloped the city, she continued, her body yielding only when sheer exhaustion forced her to collapse onto the cobbled ground. Yet, to the astonishment of those who had gathered to watch, she rose again at dawn and resumed her relentless, compulsive dancing with the same unnatural fervor as before. No plea from her husband, nor the attempts of concerned onlookers to restrain her, could break whatever hold this strange affliction had upon her. Within days, what had begun as an isolated case took on a terrifying momentum of its own. One by one, others began to succumb to the same irresistible compulsion, their bodies drawn into the strange, unrelenting rhythm that seemed to govern Frau Trophäa. In less than a week, more than 30 people had joined her, their feet moving ceaselessly across the worn stones of the city streets, heedless of pain or fatigue. By the time a month had passed, the number had swelled to over 400, and the spectacle had transformed from an inexplicable oddity into a full-blown crisis that gripped the entire city in fear. Eyewitnesses described an eerie and unsettling scene that played out day and night without respite. Men, women, and even children flailed their limbs in wild abandon, their faces contorted with expressions not of joy, as one might expect from a dance, but of torment and despair. Many sobbed uncontrollably as their bodies refused to obey their desperate attempts to stop. Others, drenched in sweat, muttered incomprehensible prayers, perhaps believing themselves possessed by some malevolent force. Some of the afflicted collapsed from sheer exhaustion, only to be roused moments later by some unseen force compelling them to continue their frenzied movements. In the most tragic cases, dancers succumbed to strokes or heart failure, their bodies simply unable to withstand the relentless exertion. As panic spread through the city, the authorities, finding themselves wholly unprepared to deal with such an unprecedented phenomenon, sought the counsel of the most learned physicians of the time. Yet, in an age when medical understanding was still largely bound to the humoral theory, the prevailing diagnosis offered little clarity or reassurance. The city's doctors concluded that the afflicted were suffering from what they termed an overheating of the blood, a condition they believed could only be remedied by allowing the excess energy to be expelled from the body in the very manner that had overtaken them, through more dancing. In a desperate attempt to control the crisis, officials arranged for public spaces, including guild halls and open squares, to be cleared so that the afflicted might dance freely, without obstruction. Musicians were even hired to provide accompaniment, and professional dancers were brought in to help guide the afflicted through their relentless movements. Far from alleviating the suffering of those caught in the grip of this mysterious compulsion, however, these measures appeared only to exacerbate the crisis, for rather than bringing about the expected relief, the encouragement of dancing seemed to spread the affliction even further. The sight of so many writhing and flailing bodies, driven by some unseen force, drew in new victims almost as if the condition were contagious, as if the very act of witnessing the dance awakened something dormant in those who had thus far remained unaffected. For centuries, scholars have struggled to explain the cause of the dancing plague of 1518, with theories ranging from medical conditions to psychological disorders, from religious hysteria to supernatural curses. The true explanation, however, remains elusive. Some medical historians have argued that the afflicted may have suffered from ergot poisoning, caused by consuming bread made from rye infected with ergot fungus. This hallucinogenic fungus, known to contain compounds similar to LSD, can cause vivid hallucinations, twitching, and convulsions. However, while ergotism can lead to tremors and delusions, it does not typically result in coordinated, continuous dancing over weeks, making it an unlikely sole explanation. Another widely accepted theory is that the dancing plague was a manifestation of mass psychogenic illness, also known as mass hysteria. Strasbourg, at the time, was a city racked by famine, disease, and economic hardship, where the population lived in a constant state of fear and religious superstition. It is conceivable that these immense psychological pressures, combined with the deeply ingrained belief in divine punishment and supernatural forces, led to a collective psychological breakdown that manifested in this strange, compulsive dancing. In other recorded instances of mass hysteria, particularly those involving religious mania, participants have exhibited similar symptoms: uncontrollable actions, trance-like states, and behaviors that defy rational explanation. Some religious scholars have suggested that the afflicted were suffering from what was known as Saint Vitus's curse, believing they had been struck down by divine punishment. The shrine to Saint Vitus, which the authorities eventually turned to in desperation, was a known site for healing rituals, and many believed that the act of dancing was both the curse and the cure. Those suffering from ailments of the mind or spirit, it was thought, could only be freed from their torment by dancing before the saints' relics until they were spiritually cleansed. Other historians have speculated that the event may have had ties to long-forgotten pagan rituals, a subconscious return to older traditions in times of extreme distress. Certain medieval sects engaged in ecstatic dancing as a form of spiritual catharsis, and the desperate, overburdened population may have found itself drawn into such behaviors instinctively, reverting to a primal and communal form of expression in response to their suffering. Whatever the truth may be, the dancing plague of 1518 remains one of history's strangest and most chilling mysteries, a reminder of the fragile boundary between mind and body, belief and reality. To this day, no one can fully explain why hundreds of people danced themselves to exhaustion, and, in some cases, to death, in the streets of Strasbourg that fateful summer. The answers may be lost to time, but the haunting image of those tormented dancers lingers, a grim testament to the power of human belief, fear, and the unexplored depths of the human psyche.